So welcome to B-Sides Las Vegas, the ground 1234 track. Today we have Nir Yosha giving his talk on his quest for privileged identity to own his own domain, privileged escalation, and lateral movement. Nir started his career as a squad leader in the Israeli Intelligence Corps. He helped with gathering intelligence, tracking the growth of terrorist organizations. Over the last 15 years of experience in identity management, user behavior, and insider threat analysis. Currently, Nir is a principal solutions engineer for Preempt. Nir publishes his posts on LinkedIn and speaks occasionally at security conferences, and we're lucky enough to have him here at B-Sides. Before we get started, though, I do need to thank all of our sponsors, especially our stellar sponsors, Critical Stack and Valimail, and as well as our other sponsors, Microsoft, Cylance, and Robinhood. These talks are being recorded and streamed to YouTube, so if you can please silence your cell phones, we would appreciate it. And so that the people who are watching online are able to hear. If we have time for any questions at the end, if you can raise your hand and I'll run the mic to you to ask your questions. And with that, let's welcome Nir to B-Sides.
Thank you. Thank you so much. How is everyone doing? Good afternoon. I'm not going to drop any old days here. I'm not going to reveal any new sophisticated attack vectors. What I will talk about are those good old Active Directory misconfigurations. Do we have any defense guys here? Anyone specifically that deals with Active Directory vulnerabilities? Yeah, so you know what I'm talking about. I work for a company that has an assessment tool for Active Directory. So what we do is we look at the identities and try to figure out those vulnerabilities. And it is still relevant, 2019. Many years after patches coming out, we still see those vulnerabilities with our customers. There is a lack of visibility on the user's access. There are specific threat detections that are still missing when we look at pass the hash, golden ticket, and we'll talk about this today. And there's no enforcement. A lot of the stuff is post-mortem. It's after the intrusion. So real story. Around 3 months ago, we were getting a phone call from a client, and he needs our assessment tool because they have this unexplained lockout of accounts. We went into the site, and we see an unmanaged device, new device in the network, that is trying to log in into the domain. And we see that there are like huge amount of users, some of which are not even part of the domain. A lot of them are getting those locked out, and we're showing it to the client. And then we see one user that successfully logged in to that unmanaged device. So we're showing it to the customer, and he's not impressed. He cares about the unlock accounts. He wants the unlock accounts, the locked out accounts, to unlock them. And he's not really, we're trying to explain to him might be a relationship between the locked out accounts and that authenticated user. And before we end up this discussion, we see that user getting into the CEO laptop, and magically, the customer started to freak out and disconnected this device, disabled the account. But the story is exactly about what I'm going to talk here today, those misconfigurations in Active Directory. So I tried to structure the talk in a sequence way, the way we see it usually. So I can call it the kill chain of owning your domain. I'm not going to focus on the initial intrusion. or the execution on objects, I'm going to look on a very narrow phase where there's a privilege escalation, lateral movement, internal reconnaissance. And as you can see here, it's a cycle. It's a cycle that keeps on happening until the bad guys get into their targets. So I have to embarrass myself. This is actually from my first B-side at Cleveland. And yes, I dressed up in my talk as a detective. That's how weird I am. The idea in my crazy mind was that because I'm talking about threat intelligence and indicators of compromise and investigation, detective will make sense. So that's what my background is. Threat intelligence, used to be in the Israeli Intelligence Corp. And I don't know how, but I guess it worked because I'm now in Las Vegas, right? So someone liked it. Okay, so we are going to skip the initial intrusions. The fact of the matter is that there are many ways to get inside the network. Mainly the portals, the open portals, VPN, OA, which I don't still understand why is still not protected by MFA in most of the companies I'm working with. And Citrix, there's escaping Citrix boxes, talks all over. And so our assumption is that we are already establishing a foothold within the network. And at this point, whether it's a malware injected into one of the processes, or hijacking some high-privileged program, or bypassing the user privilege, the UAC, we're getting a local administrator on an endpoint that is probably not our target, not our end goal. And so from an attacker perspective, at this point, I want to start to look around, just as you do with the external reconnaissance. You want to start to monitor the new environment, live off the land, so to speak, and find your next hops. Well, Microsoft is making it easy. So anyone is familiar with the GPP, group policy preferences, that allows us to set up passwords across the domain? That was introduced in Windows 2008, and we still see it with our customers today using that. Or even if they upgraded their systems to a later patch, they still have those passwords there. They don't change them. Microsoft eventually realized that this is a bad idea to send the same administrator password across the domain. They did it in phases. The first realization was we probably don't want to keep passwords in clear text within the domain controller. Probably a bad idea. So administrator were able to create VB scripts with clear text. And then Microsoft was adding a patch that will encrypt that with an AES encryption key. But around 2012, Microsoft dropped the ball and published this private key for that encryption in MSDN, public portal. So everyone could go and decrypt that XML sitting on sysvol, which, by the way, is accessible to any domain user. So what we see across the board is, even though most of the clients already upgraded the security patch that solves this problem, a lot of them forget about the file that was sitting in a sysvol folder. And what we do is we can get those files, decrypt them with the published private key, and most of the time the passwords are still relevant, still being used within the network. So Mitigation. Don't forget to remove all those exposed passwords after patching. Microsoft came up with LAPS. Anyone familiar with LAPS? So this is a solution that randomizes the password across across local administrators. There are other solutions to do that. And in many cases, what you can do is you can just disable that user. Not every endpoint requires the local administrator, definitely not the guest user to be there. Other things we see is, obviously, a lot of endpoints today are being provisioned from an image file. And so the image has a specific local admin password, and we can detect that the boot timestamp is similar between two machines. There's a chance that the local administrator is the same as well. That makes sense? Now, if we're not lucky to get those local administrators' password working for us, we will start with internal reconnaissance. So coming in from threat intelligence, it's very similar for the bad guys when they get into the network to look for intelligence gathering the same way they do it when they are outside the network. There are scanning tools. You can leverage Active Directory, and you can look for other evidence within the network. So we all know the scanning tools. One port that uniquely identifies domain controller is the LDAP global catalog. Anyone remembers which port number is the LDAP? 389. This one is not necessarily going to be Active Directory. It could be any other directory. But this port will help you to find the domain controllers in your network. The other thing I show here is which one do you think is more under the radar flags for Nmap, the top or the bottom one? The top, because when you're using scanning tools that basically killing the session immediately after starting it, this is very unique within the environment. So as an attacker, one thing to look for is to stay under the radar when using scanning. But there's an easy way, once we identify the domain controller, is to query the domain controller using those valid LDAP queries. So this is a tool called Bloodhound, which is much less noisy than Nmap or any other scanning tool because it doesn't interact with the host. It just interacts with domain controller, and it is looking for all those entities within the domain, the users, the hosts, the groups, and build this graph that gives you an idea of how the land looks like and where should you move from there. So this is an example of a Bloodhound demo where there is a target. The target is a development server. And on the top is my source. And Bloodhound finds for me one hop where I can, in this case, elevate privileges from a domain user to administrator user that is part of the domain admins and the target. So that tool is coming very handy to find my targets. And then there is the typical intelligence gathering. We still see within environments those network diagrams sitting all over, clear text passwords. And who here thinks that summer 2019 is probably a good password to spray on a network? Anyone here has summer 2019 anywhere in their environment? Yeah, that's we keep on seeing those passwords, and we'll talk about it because at the end of the day, credential is the main issue when you go to all those attack vectors that we're going to talk about. So when it comes to reconnaissance, you want to make sure your environment monitors all activities to the domain controllers. There is a very specific footprint to most of the tools, Bloodhound included. And you want to make sure you train your users around credentials. And the same thing, you keep your finance documentation, your HR documentations secure. You might want to as well put all your network diagrams secure as well, because they can be used by the attackers. Okay, so we established a foothold. We started with some local reconnaissance, and now we're ready to dump the hashes. So Microsoft is very handy, right? It gives us this process called LSAS. We'll talk about that, and we'll talk about NTDs. LSAS, probably heard of, is that process that is still today running on Windows 7 and down in kernel memory and can be dumped. Now, the LSAS keeps the credentials of not only the current users, but all the users that logged into the endpoint since the last reboot. And so potentially, you can get some good hashes over there. We will talk about NTLM and Kerberos. By the way, NTLM is actually anti-hash, what Microsoft calls anti-hash. LM, the LAN manager, is the old hash that Microsoft is not supporting anymore. But for some kind of reason, people still call it NTLM. A 2016 server and Windows 10 clients, Microsoft introduced Credential Guard. Credential Guard is a way to secure LSAS in an isolated area within memory that nobody can just access like that, even if you have or you are in a system space. But you just need one machine in your network that is not 2016. Like, anyone here has clients with still 2012 servers? Or Windows 7? Anyone 2008? Windows? NT? Wow. That's Is it connected to the network, or it's just isolated? Just like on the... that's like history. That you can donate it to museums. So yeah, so none of those operating systems can have this feature. It's not ported backwards. So Mr. Benjamin Delpy, the creator of Mimikatz, created even a workaround for Windows 10. So in the case of Mimikatz, usually in Windows 7 or 2012 servers, you would be able to use Mimikatz to dump the hashes. So this is an example of the commands running on Windows 10, and you what Mr. Delpy shows here, that you cannot really get the password now when Credential Guard is enabled. Also, Credential Guard will keep the Kerberos keys. So those are the Kerberos keys. Usually we will get them in Windows 2012 servers or Windows 7, as I mentioned. Now in 10, there's still a way around it. So custom security support provider is the component that communicates the hashes outside from the host to the server. And so if at some point someone is going to authenticate himself, the passwords are not secure anymore. They are in motion. They are secure only when they are at rest. And so what Mr. Delpy is showing here is he just injected a custom SSP. The custom SSP is supported by Microsoft. And at this point, it is being monitored and translated into a clear text. So the bottom line here is it's not a matter of whether you're going to get it. It's just whether you're going to dump it from the hash, from the memory, or wait for those credentials to get out of memory and then catch it while they're on the way. Yeah, thank you, Mr. Del. All right, the next place hashes are located is NTDs. That's it. This is basically the database of Active Directory, and it sits on every domain controller. This is a block diagram of the schema. The way it works is it's basically a database, right, based on ESE and JetBlue. And if you get a hold of that, you'll get a hold of the password hashes as well. Now, this is another demo where I can show you where the file is. So it sits under NTDs folder, and you cannot just copy the file as is because it is being used by the Kerberos Key Distribution Center, the KDC. However, you can create a shadow copy of the file. And then when you create a shadow copy for the file, you can take it offline and start cracking it. So this is what I'm doing out here. Actually, I can move it a little bit forward. Now, there's another component that needs to be used when you're looking for the hashes. It's called a boot key, and that is sitting in the registry. So what I do is I export the registry keys as well, which is under the system. And then offline, I can start to crack it. Now, sometimes you will get that message that the file is not in a clean state because we just created a shadow copy. So what you need to do, you need to defrag it, make sure that you fix all the broken pieces. And eventually you're getting this rain of hashes. That's gold. That's literally gold. Thank you so much. So in that specific case, I used the tool of Michael Grafenter that called GetAddDB account. There are other tools that can be used in order to get those hashes out of NTDs.dit. So mitigation, make sure that hashes are protected in the host by not allowing high-privileged users to get there. Because if they're getting there, they potentially can be dumped. And from an NTDs perspective, make sure you protect not only your domain controllers, but also the backup of your DCs. A lot of time, those backups are not encrypted, are not really kept safely in a place. And most of the time, when we find them, we still can get those hashes. So the other way of getting information is by stealing the hashes, which is tricking users to authenticate with you. There's a couple of ways to do that. A lot of them are based on the SMP authentication mechanism. So if you're familiar with the SMP authentication, the way it works is if I want to access a shared drive, the server is asking me to encrypt a challenge with my password hash. If it's encrypted and verified by the server, they grant me access. Otherwise, access is denied. So what can I do in order to trick a user to get into my file server? Well, I can add an HTML image tag in either a page or an Outlook HTML form. And as you can see here, it's as simple as pointing to the file server where my either responder or any other tool is waiting to collect the hashes. So there's an already built-in model there in responder, and that will allow you to get those hashes. Another way is to use custom forms in Outlook. Anyone is familiar with that? So if I get a hold of users' credentials, I can create custom form. A custom form is when you get an invite from Outlook or another email that looks different. It's because someone was crafted a specific form, and that form is synced across clients. So it's going to sync to your Outlook client within your network, even if it was created on a Outlook web access. And then that form potentially can also have a PowerShell payload, for example, PowerShell Empire. So this is how it looks like. You can create those PowerShell payloads, or you can just simply add an OLE object within an email, and then you will see here the specific session key. This is the SMP authentication that includes the source identity hash, and this could be cracked and eventually being used to move laterally and escalate privileges. So all of those things eventually are going to help you get hashes, and by cracking those hashes, you'll be able to move to the next step in our kill chain. So how to prevent that? Mitigation for stealing hashes is this specific Microsoft custom form has a patch. If you don't use the patch, the user doesn't even have to interact with it, and it will call up the SMP. If you had the patch, at least the users will get notification from Microsoft on that. Block port 445, which is SMB, outbound. There's no reason for you to have this port open. For God's sakes, my ISP is blocking my 445 outbound because they know how dangerous it is. And we still see that being opened. And block it on the endpoint as well, because the customers can take their, the clients can take their laptops home, and then when they're looking for their email at home, then the egress filtering rules are not in effect anymore. They're not going to block them. And so make sure that the endpoint is blocking port 445 outbound as well. And make sure that Windows login has a sufficient complex password, because at the end of the day, that's going to make the bad guy's life harder when they're trying to crack your passwords. All right, next is a kind of a legacy protocol that is still available in Windows 7. It's called LLMNR. It's a mouthful. And I put this here because it's just funny the way Microsoft sometimes do things. This is the way to disable LLMNR. So in order to disable LLMNR, and you probably cannot read it out here, so I'll read it for you. But basically it says, in order to enable the policy, or when you enable the policy, LLMNR will be disabled. When you disable the policy, LLMNR will be enabled. So I just thought it's funny that they're trying to make our life harder. But if it is enabled, which is basically disabled, then the attack vector works like that. You poison the subnet with a shared drive that doesn't exist, so it's not going to be resolved in the DNS. and then the victim is going to try to resolve it, and whenever the name is not going to be resolved, it's going to broadcast a question: who is, in this case, snare01? And if I'm the attacker, I will say, I'm snare01. Please send the hashes to me. And then getting the hashes, and whenever the client or the victim is trying to access, I tell him, thank you, bye-bye, got your hash, I don't need you anymore. So that's how the attack works. Now, there's definitely not a need to allow this, because we still see this enabled on clients. Just disable, enable LLMNR, and NBT, which is basically Net BIOS protocol on the network drive. Now, if you have multiple network drives, you need to do it on each and every one of them. So the disabling LLMNR can be done from group policy, but the disabling the NBT-NS cannot be done because you need to look for all your network drives first, and then you can do that using a PowerShell script. SMP signing. What is SMP signing? SMP signing is a feature that allows the recipient to make sure the SMB session is coming in from the identity. So it's basically digitally signing SMB packets and make sure the source is who it is. A lot of people don't enable SMB signing because SMB signing has some performance overload. So there's a lot of performance testing that needs to be done before enabling it. But if it's not enabled, there's another cool attack, which is called SMP Relay Attack, which is basically a man in the middle, where I somehow get my victim to try to authenticate to me with an admin rights. And then what I do is I take the admin request and I forward it to the target. And target is like, OK, well, if you who you claim you are, please encrypt my challenge. I take that request, forward it to the victim. The victim is encrypting it. I forward it back into the attacker, to the target. The target is like, OK, you get access. And as always, what do I say to the victim? Bye, bye. So that's how it works. To mitigate that, just enable SMB signing. That could be enforced via group policies. And again, make sure that you're aware of the performance implications. OK, now let's talk a little bit about Kerberos. It's kind of a headache, but if you talk about Active Directory, you have to mention Kerberos. And there are a lot of attacks based on Kerberos. So the way I kind of learned to speak about it is the analogy to an amusement park. So some amusement parks, when you go in there, you have to buy a ticket for entering the park, but then you need to buy a ticket for each and every one of the rides. Not sure it's true anymore, but that's the way I'm going to compare it to Kerberos. So there's two things that you need to know about Kerberos. Two types of tickets: TGT, ticket granting ticket, and TGS, ticket granting service. So the way authentication in Active Directory works is I authenticate myself in front of Active Directory, and then I get the TGT. This is the ticket that proves that I am who I claim I am. Now I can take the ticket, and using that ticket, I can ask to access services. For example, a file server, web server, any other services that are Kerberos supported. I get a ticket for that service, and when I get it, I present it to the specific destination application. They verify that I have the permissions, and then they create the session for me. Make sense? Now, what if I had a high privileged user hash already with me. Then I don't need to ask for the TGT. This is basically someone that just already gave me their ticket to the amusement park. I don't need to pay this. I can use it. Now, if this is a super high privileged user, which is the Kerb TGT hash, this is the master key. This is the hash that has access to all the resources within Active Directory. Then I'm golden. Okay? Then I can access anything within my environment. This is actually my golden ticket. So in order to create a golden ticket, which is basically crafting this ticket that Active Directory will believe is valid, I need to have the Active Directory information, the seed, the security ID, which I'll talk about later on, and the hash of a high or highest privileged account, the Kerb TGT. And then when I got all those ingredients, the way to prepare my golden ticket is, instructions are very simple. Just encrypt any user ID. Could be even a user ID that is not part of my domain, because Active Directory for some reason is not even verifying the user, at least for the first 20 minutes. And then use it with the Kerb TGT hash. This will prove Active Directory that you have rights to access any services within the domain. Now, another benefit there is that when you craft the ticket, you can decide how valid or for how long it will be valid. So you can really change it, from 10 hours to 10 years. Again, something that Active Directory is not enforcing. So this is the golden ticket, okay? Basically, think about it. This is the way for me to simulate or create a ticket that will allow me to access all the rides within my amusement park. So obviously, the key for a golden ticket is Kerb TGT, and that's why this is kind of a design flow, but this is something that you need to make sure you keep, and you keep rotating the password of it, because otherwise, if someone got a hold of it, basically they own you, own your domain. So Microsoft had another attribute or another way to give access to accounts that called SPN. So what is SPN? SPN comes to solve the problem of accessing services that are not directly communicating with your clients. Let me explain, give you an example. Let's say that there is a access to your Outlook server. When you're accessing your Outlook server, the Outlook server in your behalf is trying to access other resources in order to basically allow you to communicate with your emails, whether it's a database or maybe it's the web access or any other servers. And so if I get an access to this client, I get access to other servers as well. Now, Active Directory allows me to look for all those accounts, service accounts, that has SPNs, and just get those service accounts encrypted with the password hashes. But the fact that I get the password hashes will help me later on to generate those rides, those tickets that will get me on the rides, the TGSs. And so in our example here is if I got all the information, all the ingredients to create the TGS, the ticket granting service, to a specific application server, for example, my file server, my web server, then I don't need to speak with the domain controller at all. I just created my own ride ticket. So the ingredients for the silver ticket is query Active Directory for services, identify the service account that you're trying to access, and identify the endpoint that you're trying to access, and then create this TGS, ticket granting service request, that looks exactly as if it came from Active Directory. So again, the idea here is to craft it and to communicate with the service account without even communicating with the domain controller. So all of those things are eventually kind of taking advantage of the way Kerberos works today. So in the case of Kerberosing, those passwords eventually needs to be cracked. And so the more you make it harder for the users to crack them, the harder it is to generate a TGS. So we're almost there. We're getting to the end of our ride and talking about a few more attack vectors that we see out there, and then we'll kind of talk a little bit about what we can do about it in general, and the whole idea of credential theft and where's the future, right? This all new NIST suggestions on passwords and the biometrics for authentication. All of this is trying to address those attacks that I'm just talking about here. So SID, security ID, that's basically the number that identify either a host or a user within your environment. That's how it works. Microsoft had to add a attribute to users that called SID history. And the idea behind it is when you migrate from one domain to another, you need to keep the old SID, the SID that came from the old domain, and the SID that came to the new one. And of course, people will start thinking on how to exploit that feature. So the way to exploit it is, well, we know a list of known SIDs. Those are the strongest SIDs. They have a very known ID. Well, what if we'll take that SID and we will inject it into the existing user? Oh, sorry. Yep. I know. I have a high voice.
You're okay, just for the recording.
Sure, no problem. Anyone that put their earplugs can take them off. So yeah. Anyways, you inject those seeds. If you can inject them, then legitimately you can impersonate a user with no rights to have a lot of rights. And so it is very important when you migrate users from one domain to another to make sure you clean the seed history. And if you're looking for trust between domains, make sure there's seeds filtering and those seeds are being verified. And you're not falling into this seed history injection attack. And finally, there are two attacks that are kind of opposite of each other, but both are built on the fact that the domain controllers for high availability need to sync between each other. So domain controllers that, this brain that we spoke about, that we have a lot of them and they keep on communicating with each other. If I have a rogue domain controller, I can either push some bad object into the network, or I can pull some cool information from it and use it. So the sync is me replicating the data to my rogue domain controller, and the shadow is me injecting some basically backdoors that later on can be used. So in a very good example of a shadow. So remember the seed history, right? The seed history, how can we leverage both DC shadow and seed history? We can try to add a domain, register a domain real quick, push one of the objects to include a seed history of high privileged user, and then disconnect ourselves before being detected. So now we've just inserted a backdoor, and that user now can have high privileges and being used for escalation. And so mitigation there's a list of events within Active Directory that will give you a hint on someone's trying to get DC shadow, and you be aware of those basically very high fidelity level of detection. Alternatively, if you monitor all the traffic, you will be able to see those calls that pushes those requests. On the DC sync part is replicating directory feature. That's you pulling information from valid domain controllers to your mimic domain controller. And then you add yourself into the domain controller. You add yourself into Active Directory, and then you say, hey, I'm a new domain controller sitting in a remote site for disaster recovery purposes. Please send me all the hashes, and you get all the hashes there. So mitigation there is, well, make sure you have control on those specific users that have replications. So by default, not every user will allow to replicate the data back to you. So I guess the bottom line of this talk is, and I'm sorry if it was a little bit overloaded with attack vectors and details, but I think the common denominator of all those attacks is that they cannot really be fixed because they are based on design flow. Microsoft Active Directory, after 15 years, still relies on NTLM hashes when it comes to authentication. It doesn't verify the source, so you can relay NTLM hashes. You can use them from different machines. And those design flows cannot backported. They cannot even be changed because they are part of the design. Kerberos is a little bit more secure, but the same thing, as I showed you. You can forge those tickets. You can fake them pretty well. And the services that accept them don't double check it with Active Directory. There's too much trust, I would say, there on the service side. And it's all started with stolen credentials. I mean, statistics tells us that almost 50% of breaches are some kind of a stolen credentials result. Whether it's phishing, whether it's social engineering, which is just using, buying credentials on the dark web, what have you. Those things eventually will end up as a breach. Now, I'm not sure, anyone heard of those new NIST password guidelines? Yeah. So what NIST is basically saying is, listen, it doesn't work, right? All those special characters, all this, password changing, rotations every 90 days, it doesn't work. Maybe we should try something else. Maybe we should look for those easy to remember, but hard to guess type of passwords, and just keep them. So you don't need to worry about all the rotation thing. Now, I don't know if it's going to work or not. There's too many other standards out there that saying exactly the opposite. But obviously, we all acknowledge that the way passwords are handled today is a problem. And in order to improve it, we need to make sure we implement the principle of least privileges. At least make sure that the damage is not that bad by making sure everyone gets the passwords. Everyone gets the permissions that they need for their work. No more, not less, but no more. And only at the time when they need it. And make sure you do the separation of tiers. So if someone is compromised, it doesn't bleed over to the servers and domain controllers. You want to make sure that all of those zones are buffered. And use multi-factor authentication, for God's sakes. I still don't get it. Obviously for externals, but also for internal. I mean, nothing will happen if users will verify the identity, and potentially you can prevent a breach. And you can look at those risks that has to do with authentication as a spectrum, right? It's low risk, medium risk, high risk. So use adaptive enforcement. Depending on the risk, you can react differently. You can extend an MFA to verify an identity, or you can just send an email to the user and tell them, hey, did you really access this finance server, or is it someone else? And start using some controls. A lot of the attack surfaces today are based on aggregate attack surface, which means taking all the logs over all the attack surfaces and eventually kind of after the fact trying to figure out what was the reason for the specific specific breach you just got. Well, I want to have some controls in the way to potentially stop it. Yeah. Even deny access and maybe get a phone call that asks you to enable that access back. That's it, It's not the end of the world. So to summarize, 15 years later, we still have problems that probably going to stay for a while with Active Directory. So make sure you're aware of them to begin with, and make sure on the defense side that you monitor your domain controllers, because they are the keys to your crown jewels. Thank you. Appreciate your time.